Hey guys, so today we're talking about two different topics, but they are very much related. The first one is how the environment affected the colonies, how they decided where to build their cities, or how they decided what kinds of economic activities to pursue. And then the second one is slavery, and the topic of slavery really mixes in very well with the environment in the colonies because the environment was the cause of why slavery started and why it happened in such a big place. So, the first thing to know is that most of the cities in the 13 colonies were built on the East Coast. So you can look at this map here. You've got Boston, Newport, New Haven, New York. Philadelphia is really close to the coastline. All these cities, Savannah, Charleston, they're all on the East Coast so that it was really easy to trade from those cities. Remember, coastline, trade. So there are two vocabulary words that go with that. The first is the word port, and a port is a town or city with a harbor where ships load or unload their goods. So one of the harbors that we know, one of the ports we know is Boston. And here you can see the Boston Tea Party. There were the ships with all of the British tea, and these ships were in the port already, so then the people just went on and threw it off because they were mad about the Tea Act, so on and so forth. The second one we need to know is the word harbor, which is super connected with a port. And a harbor is just a place on the coast where vessels can find shelter. So that makes it easy to build a city that's a port that the ships can come into. This picture right here is Boston today. This is what Boston looks like now, and it still has that harbor. It still has that port. You can see all these ships that are here that came in to either trade in Boston or they're for transportation. People are going places. But because Boston is a harbor and a port, it makes it easy for ships to go there, increase trade, increase transportation. Another place that cities were built were along rivers. Here are two examples. This one is New York, and if you look closely at this map, this says North Hudson River, and this is the East or Sound River. So New York is surrounded on all sides by a river. Another famous city surrounded by rivers is Pittsburgh. You've got one side here, one side there. This is the Allegheny, or this is the Monongahela. This is the Allegheny. And so people built these settlements along rivers for trade, transport, and agriculture. See if you can think of another city that was also built along rivers for the same reason. So next, we've got the South. And the South was where that system of slavery really grew up. There were slaves in every colony at some point, but the South was where the vast majority of slaves were. And that happened in the South because the land there was very fertile, so fertile soil, and it was also a really good climate for growing cash crops like cotton or like tobacco or like sugar. So then the people who owned the plantations wanted labor to help them farm, and the cheapest way to get that was by actually owning people. So, however, because they brought in all of the slaves, this changed the culture of the South vis-a-vis the people in the North. So, under the plantation system, the slaves they grew sugar, cotton. They also grew tobacco for the profit of plantation owners. And the money to be made from those cash crops in those colonies created an incentive, a reason to increase the flow of slaves. Because the people in the South wanted more and more money, and they also didn't view Africans quite as equal to them, they wanted more and more slaves to be able to make more money. But what happened was that these enslaved people arrived in every colony, not just in the South, in every colony, but more in the South than anywhere else. And their cultures diffused with the American culture. This changed things like religion, it changed the things like food, it changed things like dancing, it changed the way that people talked. All of those things changed because of the cultural diffusion of the Africans into all of the colonies. So when slaves would arrive, they'd be brought on slave ships, and they would be bought and sold by people who were slave traders. They could do this because they, in their minds, didn't believe that people from Africa were equal to people from Europe. And some of that was based on the way their religion told them, but other people's religion told them otherwise. And it took a really long time for that idea to trickle down to all the people in the country. These were called slave auctions. You would have one guy up there who would have a slave that he was selling, and he would call out prices and ask people to come and pay for them. And this system of slavery was really the most brutal of anything that had happened ever. It's really similar to what the conquistadors like Pizarro and Cortez were doing with the Inca and the Native Americans in South America and Mexico. And they could do that because they really didn't believe that the people they were treating this way were actually people in the same way that they were. So they didn't see things equally, and they didn't see them the way that we see them now. And so that led them to be these really terrible, brutal people. So the jobs that slaves did were not just agricultural, but they could also be in other places in the home, such as this woman who was cooking. And when she would work in the kitchen, she would use the things that she had learned in Africa and bring those flavors and those cooking ideas, recipes over into these new places. And so that changed the type of food people ate. Jambalaya is an African meal. Gumbo is an African meal. A lot of these flavors came over from Africa. So most of the work that they did do, however, was in the fields. This is a picture of them growing cotton. And this one is of them hoeing tobacco fields. Once, it actually depended on different places, but in some places in America, slaves were given a day off on Sunday, particularly in Louisiana. And that's where the tradition of a second line came from, was because that was the one day that slaves had off. So they would use that time to celebrate and try to get away from everything, all the terrible things that they were undergoing under slavery. So it was a way for them to get away from the harsh life that they were leading on the plantation. And this really changed the way that people saw dancing in the Americas. Because these were new types of dances that people from Europe had never seen before. So in this picture, you can see like this white guy in the back, this guy here, watching the way that the Africans were dancing, the music that they were playing. And that changed the way that other people danced and other people played music in the 13 colonies. And last, religion was also a really big deal. This was something that slaves would turn to because of the really harsh life that they were living. Religion kind of offered them a salvation, something that told them that there was a better life later on, because the life that they were living right then was so terrible. One thing, though, was that a lot of Africans who came over then took the European religions, such as Christianity, and those became their religions. They lost a lot of the traditional African religions, and they took up the ones that their slave owners kind of gave to them. A lot of slaves did try to escape, but there were also lots of people who would try to kidnap escaped slaves, and it was not very easy to escape. Out of the millions of slaves in America, only a few hundred were rescued by Harriet Tubman, and a few thousand more got away on their own. But it really wasn't an easy thing to do. It was very, very difficult. A lot of these slaves escaped on what was called the Underground Railroad. That's all for today.